all you literary legends and luminaries. I'm Julie and welcome to another episode of Booksmart. Today's book is Same as Ever, A Guide to What Never Changes by Morgan Housel. This book wasn't quite what I had expected, but that doesn't mean I didn't like it. I chose Same as Ever because I thought it would give mini history lessons while showing us how these historical events and or people's behaviors sort of repeat themselves, that we can't escape certain aspects of living because such things never change. Some of what Housel writes about showcases this. I think part of my problem with the book is that Housel is a money writer, which I know on the front it says he's the best-selling author of The Psychology of Money. I avoid financial or business books as much as I avoid political books, so why I ultimately chose to buy this book on that particular day at Barnes & Noble remains a mystery. Yet interestingly enough, Same as Ever actually gave me hope that our future may not be as bleak as I think, that it will right itself eventually. So why did Housel write a book about what never changes? So let me read to you his explanation of the purpose of the book. Philosophers have spent centuries discussing the idea that there are an infinite number of ways your life could play out, and you just happen to be living in this specific version. It's a wild thing to contemplate, and it leads to the question, what would be true in every imaginable version of your life? Not just this one. Those universal truths are obviously the most important things to focus on because they don't rely on chance, luck, or accident. So Housel aims to teach us lessons about life using that which never changes. He tells us in the introduction that many of these things come from his blog, which I always have mixed feelings about a book that's been written from a blog. I bought a book to read a book, not pages of a blog, but I guess what's the difference between a book written from blog posts or one from a podcast? Seems to be the going trend. You will get a little bit of everything in this book. Don't expect it to be developed much and don't expect to fully understand very complex issues from the breadcrumb Housel leaves for us. I like to think of the book as food for thought. Those little morsels that you can chew on for quite some time long after you're done reading, that Housel has only given us a taste of so many different topics. I particularly like the one on storytelling, but let me share some others that are maybe more general audience thought-provoking. Okay, so this first one is scary. Housel writes about the risks we don't see, how it's easy to reflect on historical events and wonder how in the world we didn't see such disasters coming because it was so obvious. But when we're living in the present, we just don't know. So let me read you this about the Great Depression. And this is what he says. Even for something as giant as the Great Depression, many people were blind to what was happening even when it was well underway. The Depression, as we know today, began in 1929, but when the well-informed members of the National Economic League were polled in 1930 as to what they considered the biggest problem of the United States, they listed in order. Number 1, administration of justice. Number 2, prohibition. Number 3, disrespect for law. Number 4, crime. Number 5, law enforcement. Number 6, world peace. And in 18th place, unemployment. A year later, in 1931, a full 2 years into what we now consider the Great Depression, unemployment had moved to just 4th place, behind prohibition, justice, and law enforcement. That's what made the Great Depression so awful. No one was prepared for it because no one saw it coming. So people couldn't deal with it financially, paying their debts, and mentally, the shock and grief of sudden loss. A big part of this idea is coming to terms with how limited our view of what's happening in the world can be. So let me read that again to you. A big part of this idea is coming to terms with how limited our view of what's happening in the world can be. Limited our view. If that doesn't speak volumes with our current world right now, I don't know what is. And my apologies, something that never changes. It's ever the same. My dog and cat right now are fighting outside the door, so you hear the barking and the meowing and the scraping of claws on hardwood floors, so my apology for all the background noise. In any case, these limitations can lead to future disasters, especially when our retelling of history becomes so distorted. Housel quotes a psychologist who says this: the idea that what you don't see might refute everything you believe just doesn't occur to us. That sums up society beautifully these past few years. And remember, this is human nature, not just symptomatic of your political views. Housel writes about the good old days, or what we perceive to be the good old days. Yet with more opportunities, more materialism, more expectations, we set ourselves up for disappointment. According to Housel, the 1950s felt great because few people in your social circle lived dramatically better than you. Most people around you were in the same circumstances. We lived in smaller homes back then. Everyone wore hand-me-downs. The average family didn't go on exotic vacations. There wasn't a huge gap in your experiences versus others in your same social circle. How that has changed. So let me read you this about this gap and about the nostalgia we find in the good old days. But social media today adds a new element in which everyone in the world can see the lifestyles, often inflated, faked, and airbrushed of other people. You compare yourself to your peers through a curated highlight reel of their lives, where positives are embellished and negatives are hidden from view. Psychologist Jonathan Haidt says people don't really communicate on social media so much as they perform for one another. You see the cars other people drive, the homes they live in, the expensive schools they go to, the ability to say, I want that. Why don't I have that? Why does he get it but I don't? Is so much greater now than it was just a few generations ago. Today's economy is good at generating three things: wealth, the ability to show off wealth, and great envy for other people's wealth. It's become so much easier in recent decades to look around and say, I may have more than I used to, but relative to that person over there, I don't feel like I'm doing that great. Part of that envy is useful because saying I want what they have is such a powerful motivator of progress. Yet the point stands. We might have higher incomes, more wealth, and bigger homes, but it's all so quickly smothered by inflated expectations. So what Housel tries to prove with this chapter, low expectations equate to more happiness, which has always been true and will always be true. Housel spends a chapter on numbers, on probability and certainty. Here's a part of that chapter when he's talking about the news and how the bad news always gets more attention than the good. And I think this is something we all know just by default. The more bad it is, the more it spreads. So Frederick Lewis Allen describes how Americans stayed informed in the year 1900. It is hard for us today to realize how very widely communities were separated from one another. To some extent, a Maine fisherman, an Ohio farmer, and a Chicago businessman would be able to discuss politics with one another, but in the absence of syndicated newspaper columns appearing from coast to coast, their information would be based mostly upon what they had read in very divergent local newspapers. Information was harder to disseminate over distances, and what was going on in other parts of the country or the world just wasn't your top concern. Information was local because life was local. Radio changed that in a big way. It connected people to a common source of information. TV did it even more. The internet took it up to the next level. Social media blew it up by orders of magnitude. Digital news has by and large killed local newspapers and made information global. 1,800 U.S. print media outlets disappeared between 2004 and 2017. The decline of local news has all kinds of implications. One that doesn't get much attention is that the wider the news becomes, the more likely it is to be pessimistic. I kind of miss those days when people weren't attached to their phones, when it took a while for news to travel, that we weren't bombarded with junk all day long, every single day, right at our fingertips. You know, we can still live that way by simply putting our phones down. In a chapter entitled Calm Plants the Seeds of Crazy, Housel shows the cycle of accepting bad news and how that's the way we think it will always be, and then gradually, eventually accepting good news and how that's how we think it will always be, and then being shocked again when the bad news occurs, this endless loop. He uses the pandemic as a good example. Our modern life is as safe as it's ever been. By 2014, there was a 94% decline since the year 1900 in deaths by infectious diseases. 94% decline. He says that decline is probably the best thing ever to happen to humanity. But there's a but, because that has made the world less equipped to handle such infectious diseases, especially from a psychological standpoint. I remember during the pandemic hearing everyone whine and complain about the loss of simple things like going out to eat and how much our mental health was affected. I couldn't help but think the people in 1918 had it so much worse. But our trauma and angst is always relative. And this concept links to a chapter later on, how big changes happen only when they're forced to by necessity, where Housel gives many historical examples to when we're able to invent problem solve, and create whatever we need at the moment to save the world from disaster and hopefully ultimately to lead to greater lives in the long run. So let me read you this concept that he talks about. The fear, the pain, the struggle are motivators that positive feelings can never match. There's a big takeaway from history, and it leads to a realization that will always be true. Be careful what you wish for. A carefree and stress-free life sounds wonderful only until you recognize the motivation and progress it prevents. No one cheers for hardship, nor should they, but we should recognize that it's the most potent fuel for problem solving, serving as both the root of what we enjoy today and the seed of opportunity for what we'll enjoy tomorrow. I would never have thought of hardship as such. Housel writes a lot about the Great Depression, which makes sense with his money background. But Housel shows that when we are desperate, we're more likely to give something a shot, even if it seems bizarre, extreme, outlandish. So I'm going to read you some short excerpts from the chapter called Now You Get It, which addresses how persuasive our own personal experiences are. And these are little brief chunks altogether. So I've edited out some of the other stuff. I just want you to know that this isn't all like back to back, back to back. It's not until your life is upended, your hopes dashed, your dreams uncertain that people say, what was the wild idea we heard before? Maybe we should give it a shot. Nothing else is working. Might as well try. It's just so hard to understand that and understand how you'll respond to risk, fear, and desperation until you're in the heat of the moment. Nowhere was this more powerful than the 1930s Germany, where the Great Depression was preceded by devastating hyperinflation that destroyed all paper wealth. The book What We Knew features interviews with German civilians after World War II, seeking to understand how one of the most advanced and civilized cultures turned so sharp, so quickly, and committed the worst atrocities in human history. The interviewer says this, at the beginning of this interview, you said that most grown-ups welcomed Hitler's measures. German civilian says this, yes, clearly. One has to remember that in 1923 we had the inflation. The currency had inflated 1 trillion times. Then Adolf came to power with his new idea. For most, that was indeed better. People who hadn't had a job for years had a job. And then the people were all for the system. When someone helps you get out of an emergency situation into a better life, then you're going to give them your support. Do you think people would then say, this is all such nonsense, I'm against that? No, that doesn't happen. So this is one of the most extreme examples that exist, but the idea that people who are under stress quickly embrace ideas and goals they never would have otherwise has left its fingerprints all over history. The big takeaway here is that we really have no idea what policies we'll be pushing for in, say, 5 or 10 years. Unexpected hardship makes people do and think things they'd never imagine when things are calm. Yikes, right? This one reflects our current situation. How is this happening, right? And this connects to another concept, the concept of incentives. Housel writes, one of the strongest pulls of incentives is the desire for people to hear only what they want to hear and see only what they want to see. Housel uses Heaven's Gate as an example, yet it's not just cult members who get caught up in the push of incentives. We want to be rewarded, whatever that means to us and whatever it is we're searching for. Once again, sounds like our current political state right now. We are literally only hearing what we want to hear. And this is true for both extremist sides, not just the right or the left. That's what I enjoyed most about the book. So much was relevant to our current state. In a calmer climate, I don't know if same as ever would have had such an impact because you could have just said, whatever, and so what? But it was so easy to see the parallels with the world today. Housel summarizes well the state of our world right now, and he does so succinctly that it's kind of almost in a creepy sense here. And he says this. It's uncomfortable to think that what you haven't experienced might change what you believe, because it's admitting your own ignorance. It's much easier to assume that those who disagree with you aren't thinking as hard as you are. So people will disagree, even as access to information explodes. They may disagree more than ever because, as Benedict Evans says, the more the internet exposes people to new points of view, the angrier people get that different views exist. Isn't that what we've been experiencing these last 3 presidential elections? No matter what side you are on, this is exactly what the problem has always been. If you're always online, maybe you can just read Housel's blog. But for me, who doesn't like to read much more than a paragraph or 2 online and prefer to hold a book in my hands, Same as Ever was worth it. Little bite-sized chunks of information that left you thinking, that made this confusing world a little more understandable, and even gave me hope that things won't always be this way. Sure, it might get worse before it gets better, but it will eventually get better, right? At least according to Housel. Let me end with this, a reminder that the lack of change is sometimes baffling because we can't measure such things as human emotion. And Housel writes this. It is too easy to examine history and say, look, if you just held on and took a long-term view, things recovered and life went on, without realizing that mindsets are harder to repair than buildings and cash flows. We can see and measure just about everything in the world, except people's moods, fears, hopes, grudges, goals, triggers, and expectations. That's partly why history is such a continuous chain of baffling events, and always will be. Thanks for watching. As always, my goal at Booksmart is to get a little bit smarter one book at a time.